You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Ed Lopez of Western Carolina University. Ed, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me, Garrett. I'm a fan.
Well, thanks. That's good to hear. So Ed is the author of a book entitled Madmen, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers, The Economic Engine of Political Change, which is co-authored with Wayne Layton. And that's going to be our topic for this episode. We're going to be discussing political change. So Ed, your book starts with a story about basketball to lead into the idea of political change. It starts by talking about change in a different context in the sport of basketball. So would you like to sort of also start this conversation with that anecdote and say why it's relevant to understanding political change?
Oh, yeah, sure. I appreciate. Yeah, that's great. So I think that, sport is life and life is sport. Life is competition, and so is sports. My wife and I are raising our kids as athletes, in team sports, because we think that so many lessons of sport map onto life. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why you can think about why Wayne and I wanted to include, or actually start our book about politics off with an example about basketball. So in addition to, life mirroring sport, in a lot of life lessons sort of ways, there's this other way it mirrors that brings it closer to economics. So Wayne and I are both economists, and that's what we do is we look at human behavior and the outcomes that it generates as driven partly by the rules of the interaction. And so, when you're deciding on which how home to rent and where, which schools to send your kids to, which groceries to buy and from where, all of those decisions are, naturally the subject of economics. And we approach it from, okay, what were the rules of interaction in place when people make those decisions? And we try to tease out how those rules matter. So in the basketball case, it turns out that the 3-point line has not always been a rule in basketball. It was introduced relatively late. Same thing with the shot clock. The shot clock is a relatively late rule in basketball as well. So for folks who aren't basketball fans, the shot clock basically says the team holding the ball has a predefined number of seconds to attempt a shot, and that shot needs to hit the rim in order for it to count as an attempt. And if they don't hit the rim with an attempted shot within the 24 seconds, then the ball gets turned over and the other team gains possession. So why was this rule important? And this gets to your question. It turns out that in the 1970s and early 80s, there was no shot clock rule in college basketball. And college basketball at the time was becoming a very big revenue, big time sport with, games regularly broadcast on national TV becoming more and more of a common thing. Well, under the rule of no shot clock, there was this other development that was becoming a common thing. And it turns out it was actually bad for the game. It was bad for the competition. And it was bad for the revenue, the economics of it. The thing is, certain coaches decided that they were going to, towards the end of a game, just hold on to the ball and quit playing and just play keep away instead of basketball. Why would you do that? Well, if you're ahead late in the game, and if there's no penalty for holding the possession of the ball until the game clock runs out, you can win the game that way. And so that became more and more of a phenomenon. People called it stall ball. They called it other things. And, there was a stigma attached to coaches who played stall ball, but gradually that stigma wore off and it became kind of a dominant way of coaching. So all of this comes together on the hugest stage you can imagine for college basketball. It's a championship game in the ACC, the best conference in basketball. It was between the number 1 and the number 2 teams in the country. Huge stars on both sides, including Michael Jordan in his freshman year for Carolina, and then on the other side, Virginia was playing. Well, it turns out that Carolina was ahead at the end of the game. They played some stall ball. The fans started booing. Carolina ended up winning the game. But even the Carolina players after the game looked like they were dejected and like they didn't achieve what they wanted to do. So this rule of no shot clock led to certain behavior, stall ball, which we know is adverse to the game of basketball and to the economizing or the revenue, to the monetizing of that game. What could be done? Well, it was after that game and because of that game that the NC2A began to look into implementing a shot clock. They did so on a trial basis in a couple of conferences the following year. They did some more experimentation, and by the middle of the 80s, they had in place the 30-second shot clock for college basketball, and there was no more stall ball, and fans were cheering again, and players were feeling like they've completed their purpose and their mission. And then lo and behold, CBS starts dropping billions of dollars on the NCAA to buy the rights to broadcast March Madness, the tournament. So it's this change of rules that led people to behave in different ways, different from the adverse ways that they would be behaving, into these more productive ways that made everybody more satisfied and also more wealthy as a result. So we kicked the book off with that vignette because I think it captures the essence of what we as economists are getting at when we start to study politics. We're getting at how the rules of interaction, especially changes in those rules of interaction, can lead to different outcomes. We're especially interested in when those lead to better outcomes.
Okay, yeah. So I what's interesting about that story is that presumably this was always a problem, just inherent to the rules of basketball, that you could win with this strategy that was just not entertaining to watch or fun to do, defeating the purpose of the sport. But for the change to occur, you needed it to really, people to really start to adopt that strategy, and then people to get mad about people adopting that strategy, and then for someone to propose a rule to fix the strategy. I mean, one could imagine other rules like giving some kind of incentive to winning by a lot, or to just having high scoring games in general. But giving the other side possession, that's what they settled on, and it sort of highlights some of the difficulties here, which is why did it happen when it happened? If the game wasn't in some kind of equilibrium before, why did it persist so long? Do you want to draw out this analogy, and how do those elements work in the context of politics?
Yeah, right. I think you put your finger on something that I probably should have included in the vignette, which is that not everybody was on board with the idea of implementing a shot clock, after that failed ACC championship game. In fact, a lot of the coaches who were sitting on the bench during that time, they had adapted to the game under no shot clock. They had recruited players well suited to the absence of a shot clock. And all of a sudden, the NCAA leadership is coming in and saying, we need a shot clock. And they're saying so for revenue purposes. But the coaches and many others were against the idea. And I think that this is a way to sort of do that drawing out point that you mentioned. The book is not preoccupied with basketball. It does start out that way. But the book is preoccupied with what we call in the title political change. So political change is, economists will recognize the way we define political change. It's institutional change that happens through the political process or through political processes. So institutions such as, you can think about economic institutions such as occupational licensing, copyright protection, definition and protection of property rights and contract and so forth. All of those are arrangements under which producers and traders interact. Those are all rules for the economic game. But what's interesting is that in each of those examples, those rules are set and defined by political processes. The legislature creates a law, the courts interpret that law, the bureaucracy implements and enforces that law, and so forth. So the way that what we are preoccupied in the book with is political change. That is, when do these economic institutions undergo transformation? The copyright problem, the Copyright Act, for example, has incrementally grown in terms of the number of creative goods that it covers, the duration that it covers those creative goods, and the degree of enforcement. All right, so we have this incremental change of an economic institution there, and it's happening through political processes. That's what we're preoccupied with. There are other types of institutions that are also governed or determined by political processes, and some of those are political institutions themselves. Think about those as being the rules of interaction for policymakers. So maybe a legislature has limits on how long individual legislators can serve. They have term limits, or maybe another legislature doesn't. And that's a way to think about those also being kind of in the bucket of items that we're preoccupied with in the book. So we're interested in these processes of political institutional change, and we're interested in understanding them from our point of view, which is from the point of view of two economists. And specifically, as it will turn out, we begin to tackle this problem of political change from the perspective of public choice economics in particular, and we can elaborate on that.
Yeah. It's yeah. So we've talked about public choice on this show before, but it's the branch of economics that deals with political decision makers. And yeah, so it's interesting though that you chose change as the thing you wanted to study, because it seems just sort of, it seems like it's easier to explain the equilibrium, right? The things are this way for this reason. But with change, it's like you have the way they were before, you have the way they are after, and you have the time that the change happened, and all of those need to be explained. So if you have some theory that says like things are this way because of all these factors, and of course they couldn't be any other way, how do you explain why it hasn't been the same way for all time, or why did it change when it did, and not before, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very rich and active body of work among the economic historians on this line of questions. Like, so why did why did economic growth, historically speaking, take off when and where it did? And a lot of scholars, Douglas North, Joel Mercier, my dissertation advisor Bob Tollison, and others look at the institutional changes that are happening in Northern and Western Europe around the time when economic growth takes off, basically around 1700s. And, the explanation there is, well, institutions became more in the sort of growth attractive forms of sound property rights, contract, freedom to trade, and so forth. And these are the things that ended up attracting people's prolonged attention in investment projects, risk taking in trade over long distances and long periods of time, and so forth. All of those other things that lead to growth. And so there's an institutional story, there's a change in institutions story that the economic historians are telling about why we are all in the modern world have experienced economic growth. And so we did intentionally set out to focus on change of institutions as opposed to a received arrangement or a status quo arrangement of institutions. But let's spend a minute or two talking about how we got to that, how we got to that deliberate choice. And it has a little bit to do with how we rely on public choice theory, public choice economics, and also where we draw the limitations of public choice economics. So in our approach, we have these three overarching questions about political institutions. Now, whether it's occupational licensing or copyright or eminent domain or whatever it is the case, agricultural subsidies, we can use the tools of economics to measure the impacts of those institutional arrangements. We can measure both the efficiency of those arrangements. Are they growth enhancing? Are they instead, welfare reducing? A lot of the heavy lifting gets done by traditional cost benefit analysis, which is based on neoclassical welfare analysis. We can measure the efficiency effects of policies like that. And then we can also measure the equity and distributional effects. So, for example, which socioeconomic demographic is really bearing the burden of the costs of this program, and which socioeconomic demographics are really reaping the gains of this program, right? We can analyze the distributional effects. So when we do this, we oftentimes bump up against real world policies that are on the books that are, first of all, inefficient. They don't pass a cost benefit analysis test. They are more costly than they are beneficial in their effects. But they're also unjust in the sense that they have distributional effects that basically nobody would want to defend. So, for example, you remove employment opportunities of poor people while enriching or lowering the taxes of rich people, right? If you were to try to advocate for a policy based on that distributional effect, making the poor worse off, making the rich better off, you would have a hard moral case to make. And so we go around, we look at the efficiency and the equity effects of many policies, and we find out they're both wasteful and unjust. So our first question is, why do political processes tend to get themselves to the point where they enact policies, they change economic institutions, in other words, to create outcomes that are inefficient and unjust? Well, for this question, the area of public choice economics has a very straightforward and well-developed answer. The basic answer is rent seeking. Political processes end up creating policies that are wasteful and unjust because they don't necessarily respond to efficiency and equity concerns. Instead, they respond to pressure groups and interest group concerns. And the pressure groups and interest groups that have more of an influence over the political process are going to be the winners in this distributional game. And so rent seeking, the literature on rent seeking in general is our answer to this first question. Why do wasteful and unjust policies come onto the books in the first place? So if you want, I can elaborate on that a little bit, or we can move into the second question. Again, try to get to the point why we're focusing on change, and it has to do with these three overarching questions.
Yeah, well, the rent seeking issue is really interesting. There's I sort of waffle back and forth between sort of thinking, oh, we have all these bad policies because of rent seeking, and we have bad policies because people are just mistaken and they genuinely want what's best, and they're just they think what's best is to pour a bucket of water on a drowning person or something. Like, they just are fundamentally wrong about what will help. And ultimately it seems like it's a mix of both when you get bad policies and they're persistent and they last a long time. But yeah, if you want to elaborate on the rent seeking point,
isn't it more the inability of policymakers to get the knowledge needed to write efficient policies? So, what is the efficient what is the efficient coverage and duration of copyright protection? You can run an economic model that will give you an answer to that. Yeah, but that answer that comes from an economic model is going to depend. It's going to depend on the parameters that are estimated in that model, and those parameters might be consistent with experience up to the writing and solving of that model, but they might not map onto future experience. And so our best guesses about what is the efficient policy rule, they tend to fall short. The Austrian economists will call this the knowledge problem, coming after F.A. Hayek's famous 1945 article in the American Economic Review, The Use of Knowledge in Society. And so, on the other hand, this rent seeking story is telling more of an incentives problem. Policymakers don't have the incentive to do what's efficient. Instead, they have the incentive to do what the most powerful interest group in the room says they want. And so, one way to frame the rent seeking question is, well, is it all the incentive problem, or is there also this knowledge problem in play? And Peter Boettke and I have a paper in the Review of Austrian Economics from around the year 2000 or so, where we get into this question in some detail. And what we do is we alternatively relax each of those assumptions. And so there's a broader literature that does this, and they'll say, okay, what if there were no knowledge problem? How bad would the incentive problem drive us into inefficient and unjust policies? By the same token, how bad is the knowledge problem if we were to neutralize by assumption and say that policymakers are benevolent, they're not self-interested, they don't respond to interest groups, but instead they try to create maximum efficiency and minimum injustice? Well, even if they are benevolent, they're going to bump up against the inability to get that policy right. And so at the end of the day, the Austrian political economy approach would say that both the knowledge and the incentive problem are in play, and both of them are limitations on policymakers to do what people think of as the right thing. So yeah, I would say it's not merely seeking the story, but the story that comes from public choice theory mostly is rent seeking. When we merge that along with the story that's coming from Austrian political economy, we get both the incentive and the knowledge problem.
Yeah, yeah. And those two combined can explain a lot of dysfunction. But how do you go from that to explaining why you sometimes you have a dysfunctional system or a bad rule or something, and then everyone kind of realizes it's bad and gets together and changes it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so great. I mean, that really anticipates the second of our sort of overarching questions. The second one is related to the first question. The second one says, look, if we have policies that are on the books and they've been demonstrated to have these inefficiencies and these unjust distributional effects, and everybody knows it, how is it that they stay on the books? Why is it that they endure despite the fact that people recognize they're being inefficient and unjust? And so here's where the powerful status quo comes into play. And similarly, on this second question, as it was the case for the first question, public choice theory provides a well formed response to it. So why is it that bad policies stay on the books? The basic answer is called the transitional gains trap. Transitional gains trap says something. Let's take an example. A few years ago, the House Republican caucus was if I have that right, I think that's the right group that was doing this. They were assembling a platform of policies before an election season, and what they did was they put on the table repeal of the mortgage interest deduction. And through the mortgage interest deduction, taxpayers, people who file their 1040s, can deduct from their taxable income any amounts that they paid in mortgage interest that year. And so it's a sizable tax benefit to people who have mortgages. And so the question is, should we repeal this thing or not? The basis for repeal is a set of studies by the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, that have looked at this and basically concluded what we've been talking about. It's inefficient. In this particular case, housing is counted as investment in the national income account, in the GDP calculations, I should say. And so this mortgage interest deduction diverts investment spending toward housing and away from other areas of investment. Many of those other areas of investment would have been more productive in terms of increasing GDP compared to the investments in housing. So it's a price distortion that leads investors into less productive ways of investing compared to what they would do otherwise, and it takes a pretty big chunk out of GDP and GDP growth. This is the GAO study in a nutshell. So along comes this House Republican caucus or whatever, and they say we should get rid of this thing. And they announce that in a press conference that they're going to put it in their platform. Well, overnight, they start getting emails and phone calls and knocks on the door, and some of these are from folks that they've known a long time. They're from because these folks are lobbyists on K Street, and they represent organizations like the National Association of Realtors and the National Association of Home Builders. And all these emails and all these knocks on the door basically said, you know what, we think it's a really bad idea for you to repeal the mortgage interest deduction. And pretty soon, it may have been overnight. Like I think actually it literally was overnight. This House Republican caucus body that was assembling the platform said, never mind, we didn't mean it. The repeal of the mortgage interest deduction is now off the table. Okay, so this story captures the transitional gains trap. The mortgage interest deduction goes back a few decades. And think about the folks who were, homeowners, mortgage owners, I should say, in the early days of that program. Well, they're going to get the tax benefit, but what's going to end up happening is they're also going to see their home prices increase, because this is part of the transitional gains trap argument. Because the value of the asset that a political favor is attached to is going to go up in an amount that's commensurate with the value of the political favor. So your home prices are going to go up in a magnitude that's commensurate with the economic value of the mortgage interest deduction. So early folks who were, early in this program, they could experience the tax benefit as a gain, and they could also experience the increased home price as a gain once they sell their home, that is. Fast forward a generation or two generations, maybe you've recently bought a home, and when you go to buy your home, what you're doing is you're paying for that mortgage interest deduction up front, because the price of the home that you're buying reflects the value of that tax benefit, the net present value of it, into perpetuity, or at least for the duration of your mortgage loan. So you see how that works is the phrase is that the market has capitalized the value of the political favor into those assets that the political favor is attached to. Now, this is really going to be what explains why when a bad policy is on the books, it's hard to get rid of it. It's because the folks who are benefiting from the policy staying on the books have this capitalized value of their assets at stake. And so when you come around and say, when a policymaker comes around and says, we need to get rid of this thing, the beneficiaries of this thing come in and say, we think that's a bad idea. And some of those are powerful enough to keep it from going anywhere. So there are other examples of this, like the sugar program, which benefits domestic sugar growers. And, for generations has been recognized, at least by some people, to be inefficient and unjust and worthy of getting rid of. But even, powerful figures like former presidents, including JFK and Ronald Reagan, have set out to, repeal big parts of the sugar program. And they've been denied because of the power of the status quo around it. They've been denied because of the transitional gains trap. So, wrapping up that point, the second question is, why do bad policies stay on the books? And public choice theory provides this response. It's because of the transitional gains trap.
Yeah, and to just be, this is slightly tangential because I know the mortgage interest deduction isn't like central to your point, but just to be clear about that, if you bought your house before there was a mortgage interest deduction, and then they introduced it, then it became capitalized into the value of your house. You got a significant benefit from that policy, and repealing the policy would just take away the benefit you got. But if you bought your house after the policy was enacted, and then they then they repealed it, you'd be strictly worse off than, you're not losing something you gained, you're actually losing something that someone else gained, the property owner who owned the home when the policy was enacted. So you're in this situation where um a lot of people would be significantly worse off, and these aren't necessarily the same people who gained when the policy was enacted. And so like from their perspective, it does seem really unfair. Like, why should they lose a large fraction of their life savings, even if this rule is inefficient? They didn't actually benefit from it. Yeah, and similarly, like with the sugar thing, in like a general equilibrium, if the policy had never been enacted, like sugar subsidies, or I'm Canadian, so I think of supply management we have for dairy and eggs. In general equilibrium, those industries are going to earn roughly the same level of profit, if there's free entry, as every other industry. But well, I guess okay. But the transition, it's the change that makes the incumbents much worse off, and that's why it's so hard to fix those policies.
Another way to visualize this is think about all the reasons why taxi drivers protest the legalization of ride sharing, Uber and Lyft. Well, taxi drivers almost universally have paid up front for a license to drive a taxi, and that value, that payment up front is part of the sort of capitalization, the market capitalization of the value of the policy. Okay, so if you're going to say you can't drive a taxi in New York City without a taxi medallion, without a taxi license, that's an artificial restriction of supply. It's an administratively determined restriction of supply. Well, when you restrict supply, the price of the item in question is going to have upward pressure on it. And that's what has happened with the available supply of taxi medallions. And so typically a taxi driver has paid, six figures, in some cases even seven figures just for the license. And now you're saying that Uber and Lyft can come along and start driving people around without having gone through that same, requirement of obtaining a costly license. And so there are some equity effects in both directions. Mike Munger talks about this problem as possibly being a regulatory taking. And I think that depends on how you frame the taxi driver's willful act of purchasing a license. I think that one way to frame it is to say you're getting into bed with an administrative body that might not have a high certainty of their continuing with their current path of policies. So watch out. I think the broader point is this this question of in the case of the sugar program and the taxing medallion, in the case of the sugar program and the mortgage interest deduction and others like that, we haven't seen any political change happen. Those policies have stayed on the books. The status quo behind those policies has continued to win. But in other areas, namely the taxi medallion one and some others which we can talk about, we have seen this sort of reform or repeal of the regulatory status quo. And it has led to this sort of reassignment of economic institutions and reassignment of behavioral patterns, and it's led to demonstrably better outcomes in many ways, recognizing that in some ways rideshare has had its problems compared to taxis too. So basic point is like our third question is, building on the first one, why do bad policies get there in the first place? Continuing to build on the second one, why do bad policies stay there when people know they're bad policies? The third one poses a question, why do bad policies occasionally get reformed and repealed? And this is a question, unlike the first two, where public choice theory did not have a well-formed, ready set of answers to it. This is where, going back to your earlier question, where we began to sort of deliberately focus on the change of institutions, because this is where we thought we have the ability to make a real contribution in the book, where we can really do some novel stuff as opposed to tell new versions of older stories. And it's on this response to question 3. So public choice theory can't really help us there. We know it's happening in the world. We can see it happening. We can see, the old regime of airline rate and route regulation, for example, in 1978 being repealed, and the price of airfare, moving from being determined by the Civil Aeronautics Board in Washington, D.C., and instead moving towards being determined by supply and demand in the marketplace. We can see spectrum regulation, for example, move from the Federal Communications Commission is going to administratively decide which parties have access to bands of spectrum and exactly how they can use it. The old regime, into around the 1990s, we began to see the FCC auctioning off bands of spectrum, and the winners of those auctions having the right to, or I should say the title to utilize the spectrum, still in some predefined and regulated ways. But it's not, we go from an administrative bureaucratic decision of who can use it to a market mechanism for deciding who can use it. We see lots of these examples. And so, similar to how the shot clock became implemented in the NCAA to improved outcomes, we're interested in understanding how did these institutions in airline deregulation and in taxi deregulation and lots of transportation and trucking and railroads and so forth, also in airlines and spectrum, what are the determinants of those political processes that lead us towards a more market definition of these economic institutions? And again, I think that that's where we think that our contribution lies, and partly it's because public choice doesn't give us a ready set of solutions for that, and that's kind of why we wrote the book in the way that we did. Along the way, we tell the story of how public choice theory emerged out of the history of economic thought, but towards the end of the book, we really deploy that and we start to say, here's how we can build on that to explain these market enhancing institutional changes. So yeah, that's our basis. That's a little bit more on why we focus on the change question.
Yeah. So I want to tie in Mike Munger's point about takings. To be clear, that means that people are legally entitled. If you recognize something as a taking, then people are entitled to be compensated when something is taken from them. Have any of those, the political changes you study, involved just paying out the income, paying the incumbents and compensating them for their loss in order to enact a policy that is, has some efficiency gained? Have they ever taken that approach of, look, we know you benefit under the status quo, or you would lose under this change, but it's so beneficial that we can afford to just pay you to compensate you for your loss? Is that a model of change that we've seen, or is that more theoretical?
Yes, I think both of those are the case. So one way to think about this is to say, come back to not the subtitle of the book, which has political change in it, but the title of the book, which has these interesting characters named madmen, intellectuals, and academic scribblers. Well, these are three sort of categories of actors in the political process that have this influence on institutional change. They have this influence on political change. And your question is about, do they need to have some incentive to want to move forward with that change, move forward with that repeal or reform of the status quo? And the answer is absolutely yes. One of the phrases that that the book sort of hangs its hat on is that political change requires it to be in the interests of the madmen in authority. Madmen in authority is a phrase that, as far as I know, was coined by John Maynard Keynes towards the end of his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Rent. Excuse me, Employment, Interest, and Money. And he's referring to policymakers, legislators, and people who work in the administration who work in bureaucracies who basically have their hands on the levers of rules changes, right? In the NCAA example, it would be the executives at the NCAA headquarters. They can implement a shot clock if they want to, even if the coaches predominantly opposed the idea. Well, similarly speaking, members of Congress, if there's the right winning coalition, can do things like, repeal the Civil Aeronautics Board, like authorize spectrum license auctions from the FCC, like deregulate taxis and so forth. It might not always be the national legislature; it might be the city council or the state legislature who does these things. But those are the madmen in authority. And the answer is yes, it needs to be in their interests if they're going to make that reform or repeal. So if you think about the status quo, any particular time and place, and the rules that define that place, the rules of economic institutions, for example, that define that time and place, any status quo is going to have a set of interests that have adapted to and essentially taken shape around that set of institutional arrangements. The taxi drivers, they like the medallion regime. They don't necessarily like having to pay up front so big for the medallion, but they like the regime the way it is, especially compared to, getting rid of licensure and just letting in any old Lyft or Uber driver. They also have, so the status quo has their interests that have sort of ossified around it. And then there are also, arguments for why we should keep that status quo. Rider safety is at stake. Driver training and quality and so forth. These are the arguments that would favor not repealing or reforming. So that's your status quo. It has both interests and ideas defending it. But then there are alternatives to the status quo. The reformers, the would-be reformers, right? And similarly speaking, there are interests and also ideas behind those. And so institutional change in our framework is this battle among the interests and the ideas of the status quo against the interests and ideas of alternatives. And essentially, what the madman in authority has to decide is which way to direct the lever. And to some extent, it's going to depend on which way is better for them. As it turns out, in the case of spectrum license auctions, the incentive play for the madmen in authority turned out to be the revenue that these things would generate. All right, so we're talking about 1993. We're talking about Bill Clinton having been recently elected, partly on, this is going to sound insane from the perspective of 2019, but Clinton got elected partly on being a deficit hawk. Okay, he wanted to reduce the deficits and federal deficits and begin to pay down federal debt. I know it's a crazy idea from 2019, but that was the situation in 1993. And it turns out that these spectrum license auctions would generate sufficient revenue to make some pretty serious dents in the annual deficits. And so that's your play for how it was in the interests of the madmen in authority at the time. And there's this cute little vignette we tell in the book about how for the first auction, President Clinton actually went to the FCC and stood there with the commissioners and the chair and had, a big photo op with the gigantic, check written out to the U.S. Treasury for $7 billion, and capturing his persona, Clinton, as people were taking their places for this photo op. Kind of gave a nudge, a little bit of an elbow to the person standing next to him, and said, "I'd go anywhere for a check this big," right? And so that's, I think, a way of a cute little aspect of that vignette to sort of capture. It does have to be in the interests of the madmen and authority in order for political change to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. But was there a distinct group of people who benefited from not auctioning off the spectrum? Were there groups opposed to that? This is something I'm not super familiar with.
Right. So I would say that there are kind of one group for the ideas component, one group for the interests component. The group for the interest component was the the um, the parties out there in the economy that had the rights. I should say again the license to use a band of spectrum, and then this band of spectrum is now going to get auctioned off. Tom Hazlett has a fantastic book called The Political Spectrum, where he tells the history of this whole story, and it has to do a lot with emerging technologies that make that sort of creatively destruct older technologies, and those older technologies had relied on access to bands of the frequency spectrum. So basically, radio. As radio begins to decline, and they have less of an economic demand for using the spectrum, they're going to be less of a potent force in defending that status quo. And this is a big part of the story with spectrum license auctions, is that the interests around the previous status quo began to deteriorate. There just wasn't as much at stake in keeping the old system in place, therefore loosening up the move to the newer auction based system. So that's the interests component, defending the previous status quo. And then there were also an ideas component defending the previous status quo. And basically, by 93, all of these folks had come around in the sense that there was really no one left vigorously defending the administrative process of deciding who gets to use spectrum. Most people had come around to defending the sort of auction, or at least the property, the sort of property regime, or at least the auction-based regime instead. But that took a long time. The original idea for this was published by Ronald Coase in 1959. And so if you count forward to the first spectrum auction, it took 35 years. And you can think about that duration, you can think about that 35 years as at least in part an important part, but at least in part being how long it took to convince the regulators, the experts, the economists, the lawyers inside the commission that this was the better idea. And so, yeah, it did take some time. I do recommend Tom Hazlett's book, as well as Wayne. Wayne has a couple of articles separate from our book on how a similar reforms were done in other countries, mainly Guatemala and also in El Salvador. And listeners can follow those down for more details about how the interests and the ideas lined up in the status quo and the alternatives on spectrums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one thing I really like about this example is just how much it aligns to what economists like. It's exactly what an economist would suggest. If you have an asset and it's super valuable, but you need to divide it up, like have an auction. And I believe like the design of the auction was done by auction theorists, which prior to that was a very niche branch of like microeconomics, and became prominent because of these auctions. And like you said, it started with Coase. So yeah, I really like the role of economists in this, and I mean the title of your book includes intellectuals, and at least in the spectrum auctions, those intellectuals were the economists. But do you want to talk about the role of intellectuals in this and other political changes?
Right. Good segue there. Good question, because we haven't really touched on the other two characters, the madmen being one, the intellectuals and the academic scribblers being the other two. I think in some ways it might be easiest to start with with the academic scribblers. This is the set of activity, or the set of folks who sort of originally pen an idea for reform. So in the spectrum auctions case, it was Ronald Coase's 1959 paper and it was simply titled the Federal Communications Commission, where Coase worked out the arguments for treating spectrum like real property. In other words, having boundaried ownership. And then things flowed from there. Interestingly, the auction theory that led that was that economists worked out in the 70s, 80s, leading up to the auctions of spectrum in the 90s. They this is very formal theory, lots of intricate problems getting worked out. Interestingly, a lot of the same models are used in the rent-seeking literature that we talked about earlier. In fact, rent-seeking is often characterized as being a form of an auction. And so there's an interesting connection in the history of thought. And another to keep giving some visual on who the academic scribblers are. If you go back to the basketball shot clock story, it turns out, where did the whole idea for a shot clock even come from? Well, it goes back to the early 50s when there was a owner of a professional basketball team, and he was losing revenue because his coaches in the professional league were playing stall ball. And so he did a little back of the envelope, literally a back of the envelope type of calculation, and came up with 24 seconds. And this was the sort of original authoring, original coining of the idea for a shot clock. And so that gentleman's name was Danny Biasone, and he was an Italian immigrant who owned a restaurant in Syracuse, but also owned a basketball team there, and wrote his idea on the back of an envelope at his restaurant one night. And so he's kind of like this academic scribbler type of person. With most of the episodes of political change that we talk about, there's some similar role in place, some similar point that you can trace back an idea for reform to, and that's where we identify an important component of political change. That is the idea for what alternative to move towards relative to the status quo. What idea should we adopt instead of the status quo? And so that's the function of the academic scribblers. And to a large extent, that's a function of a big share of the economics profession these days, is working out ideas that have policy implications, and therefore, doing this original penning of reform ideas. The intellectuals, this is a phrase that, or this is a term that many authors have used in observing social change. We're most closely aligned with F.A. Hayek's usage of intellectuals in his 1949 essay titled The Intellectuals and Socialism. And Hayek in this essay is sort of preoccupied with something that will sound familiar from 2019, which is, why is everybody interested in socialism? Why has socialism become more attractive, both to what he would call the common man, but also to the sort of what he calls the practical man, or what we would call the madman in authority? Why is socialism becoming more popular and also more reflected in our economic institutions? This is his central problem that he's working through in this 1949 essay. And the intellectuals play a key role for him in that. The intellectuals being not the original authors or coiners of ideas, but subsequent translators and amplifiers of those ideas. So they're not idea originators in and of themselves, but they do have this knack for being able to, being versed in the language and the technology used by the idea originators. They get it, essentially. They get it at these abstract academic levels. But their real gift, Hayek says, is the ability to sort of package that same idea in ways that large mass numbers of people can also get. So Hayek calls them middlemen of ideas. And so that's what the intellectual class is. And so, if you fast forward from 1949 through the decades, and you observe the new technologies for communicating ideas about what's happening in the world, right? You see the emergence of, we already had television in 1949, of course, but you see not too long after that, the emergence of cable TV and this proliferation of the number of channels that you can watch. And so it goes from being a world where Walter Cronkite is basically who everybody watches for the news. And, he becomes famous for his end of the newscast quip, which is, if I get it right, if I get it wrong, I probably get it wrong. My wife will laugh at me. But it's something to the effect of, and that's the way the news is, right? You go from that world where you basically have a monopoly or, a oligopoly of information supply to this proliferation under cable news. And then later on with talk radio, and then later on even with internet and email, and later on with World Wide Web, there's this continual creative destruction of the communication technologies that intellectuals can use to get their message out to mass audiences. And so therefore, what does the class of intellectuals look like today in 2019 compared to 70 years ago in 1949? Well, lots of folks count as intellectuals today because they're amplifying ideas. And so this could open up into discussions about social media platforms and fake news and so forth. And I think that's worthwhile. But to bring it home and ground it into what we do, turns out the intellectuals are very important to the episodes of political change that we've studied and that we're trying to pin down. At some point, the status quo becomes so inefficient and so unjust that it becomes really hard to defend. But if nobody recognizes that out in the common man space, as Hayek would use that term, common man, if people don't get the message that the status quo needs to be reformed, then that it's not going to break down as easily. It's likely not to break down. And so the intellectuals play this important role of saying, you know what, everybody out there on Main Street, having the Civil Aeronautics Board determine how much you pay for flying from point A to point B in the country is a really bad idea. And here's why, in plain terms that everybody can understand. And that becomes a very important ingredient in the episodes of political change that we've been studying. So there you have your madmen intellectuals and academic scribblers.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and we see this where the some ideas have been propagated, and any random person on the street can if you ask someone about climate change, that's something that the intellectuals have really spread those ideas. But if you ask them about compensating organ donors, then that's something that the intellectuals haven't really communicated to the public, at least as of right now. It's one of these ones I'd like to see communicated. But yeah, if without that crucial ingredient, things don't really change. Or there's you have the interest group who benefits or doesn't want change. They know about the issue. Then you have the public completely uninformed with no idea. And even if they have a significant, even if they have a lot to gain by some change, if they don't realize it, then they can't be part of making the change happen.
Yeah, so if you want to be a good rent seeker, you got to pick an issue that nobody's going to want to pay attention to, like the sugar price. And no matter how many GAO studies come out that show how it just does not pass the economic sniff test, it's going to be hard to get a lot of mobilization behind repealing that, But on other cases that are really salient, I do think actually on the kidneys, on the vital organ transplant question, it seems to me anyway, just in the way I observe things, that there's been some serious progress in the last 5-10 years on this issue in terms of what, the general public, what Hayek's common man, what the Main Street understanding is on this. And so I think, it comes down to the intellectuals continue sort of just pecking away at this, scraping away, chipping away at this. You might have listened to the Econ Talk with Russ Roberts' podcast, and then her underlying New York Times article. She's a New York Times journalist, and it's a fantastic example of how intellectuals can not only change the broad understandings out there, but new understandings themselves. She describes how she went into this project, again, writing about the legal market for kidney donations in Iran, the only country in the world that does it. She went into it thinking she was going to find exploitation all over the place. But she came out of it thinking instead, actually, the exploitation occurs when organ sales are not legal. And I think that that's a powerful message. That's a powerful set of arguments that, taken together with a bunch of others that are, again, continue sort of chipping away at this. I believe we've had a change in the public attitude towards organ sales. Maybe not enough to tip the admin and authority on it, but nonetheless, I think it's there. I think it's valid to say that we're changing the climate of ideas around this question.
Well, we're short on time, so do you want to give any closing thoughts, any sort of general takeaway someone who's listened to this conversation should have?
Let me say maybe two things on this. The first thing is that public choice is not necessarily a basis for political pessimism. You know, we're drawing out the systematic tendencies behind beneficial reforms. Beneficial in the sense that we're eliminating inefficiencies and eliminating inequities. And our understanding of how this works is coming out of public choice theory. So it's public choice is not necessarily, this counsel of despair or this basis for being a pessimist. Wayne and I have been called the optimistic public choice guys. And so I think that that's one takeaway that I'd like listeners to chew on a little bit. And the other is that, questions of political change there's no shortage of supply of questions of political change. So this is something that anybody can get interested in and begin to work on and study themselves. And, we have our website puts our framework up on it in a little interactive way that folks can sort of see what the components of it are and maybe do a case study based on our framework of an episode of political change that they're interested in. So, the main ingredients there are the alternatives, the ideas and the interests of alternatives, finding sort of loose spots in the structure of ideas and incentive and interests that protect the status quo. So the status quo needs to be sort of punctured in some way, destabilized in some way. That can happen in a number of different ways, but that's the role of the case study to sort of show how in each particular case it did unravel. So I think it's fascinating stuff. It comes out of economics and public choice. It matters to real people on the ground, so to speak. And there's lots of remaining questions that can be tackled using the approach. So thanks for letting me dish on my preferred takeaways.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. My guest today has been Edward Lopez. The book is Madmen, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers, The Economic Engine of Political Change, which I'll link to at economicsdetective.com. Ed, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me, Garrett, and thanks for running a great podcast.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio. I want to give a special shout out to my newest patrons on Patreon, Daniel and William, since I've been actually mentioning the Patreon page over the past few weeks. I've got some more interest in it. And the great thing about Patreon is it helps to offset the costs of doing this show, and eventually we get enough patrons, I'll be able to outsource more things, get someone else maybe writing the show notes and posting the episode, and that'll just make it easier for me to consistently produce episodes, even as my life is gradually changing with me finishing my PhD and all that goes along with that. So what is Patreon? It's a platform that allows you to make recurring donations to people who create content you consume. So you can do a per episode fee. I think the incentives are lined up particularly well for per episode rather than monthly, because I really need an incentive to make more episodes, right? Not just to allow the passage of time. Come to think of it, that would actually make a good study. Do podcasts that do monthly Patreon donations, do less content than ones that do per episode. Anyways, thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon, and thanks to everyone who listens. I'll be back next week with a new episode.